Good evening. I see there's still a few people getting settled, but I'm going to dive in. I'm Bridget Doherty, and it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity on behalf of the Art and Archaeology Department to introduce today's speaker, Mark Haxthausen, the Robert Sterling Clark Professor of Art History at Williams College. In 2002, as some of you in the room will no doubt remember, he was here as a member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute. With characteristic modesty, and I should say also with emphasis, Professor Haxthausen has asked that I keep this introduction brief. I shall try to do so, but his accomplishments as a scholar and as a teacher of art history make that task especially challenging. Beginning with the path-breaking monograph, Paul Klee, The Formative Years, published in 1981, he has staked out a broad field of expertise in the history of modernism with special emphasis on art in Germany, from Max Beckmann and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, to Klee and his Bauhaus colleagues, to Sigmar Polke and Anselm Kiefer. His writings on art theory and criticism have also been vital to the field and to our understanding of the work of Wilhelm Hausenstein, Wilhelm Hausenstein, Walter Benjamin, and Carl Einstein, the subject of a book forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press, Refiguring Vision, the Art Theory and Criticism of Carl Einstein. Professor Haxthausen is also a curator of note. From 1976 to 1980, he was both a member of the Faculty of Fine Arts at Harvard and a curator at the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and he served as the museum's director from 1980 to 1983. More recently, he curated the exhibition Sol LeWitt, The Well-Tempered Grid, at the Williams College Museum of Art, which was recognized with the Association of Museum Curators Award for Outstanding Exhibition in a University Museum in North America in 2012. The Art and Archaeology Department is deeply in debt to Professor Haxthausen's exceptional generosity and rigor as a teacher, for he has over the years helped to direct our way a number of extraordinary young art historians who first undertook graduate or undergraduate work with him at Williams. They know firsthand, and we through them, why he was a natural choice for the College Art Association's Award for Distinguished Teaching of Art History in 2009. We're in for a real treat today, and it's a very special thing indeed to hear Professor Haxthausen speak about Klee. Please join me in welcoming Mark Haxthausen back to Princeton and to the Institute of Advanced Study.
Thanks so much. It was long, but it was really nice. Thank you very much, Bridget. That was touchingly generous. I really appreciate it. In the year 1921, in his book Kairouan, or A Story of the Painter Klee and of the Art of This Time, the eminent German art critic Wilhelm Hausenstein declared his subject the quintessential artist of the moment. Yet his reasons made the honor an ambiguous one. And I quote, "We have entered an epoch of anarchism and disintegration. The painter Paul Klee took from his time what it was. He saw what it was not, saw its vacuum, its fissures, saw its ruins, and set above them. His name represents no system. His art is irrational, naive even in its most sophisticated deliberations. It is faithful to the unheard of confusion of the age." Such gloomy words seem strangely discordant with our image of Klee. They must have seemed especially incongruous when read alongside the artworks illustrating Hausenstein's book, of which you see several here. For most of us familiar with Klee's art, his name evokes humor and charm, fantasy and poetry, witty and evocative titles, aesthetic enchantment, delights for the mind as well as the eye, not fissures and ruins, not anarchy and disintegration. What confusion was Hausenstein talking about? To be sure, the confusion of modernity was by then a well-established trope. Yet if we read Hausenstein's previous writing, we will see that he had something more specific in mind. The symptom of the confusion of the age was the confusion of styles, and that confusion was manifest in Klee's art more than any other. And in the years following the publication of Hausenstein's book, it would get worse, much worse, as a random selection of clay pictures from any year up to his death in 1940 shows. And here I show you a sampling of works from the year of 1930. We find styles figurative as well as abstract, geometric as well as biomorphic, linear as well as painterly, severe styles alongside more fluid ones. We take the confusion of styles for granted now, even if no single artist since Klee has ever matched him in this regard. Yet at this time in Germany, such confusion was to many a worrisome phenomenon of modernity. There was among many artists, architects, and intellectuals a fervent longing for a unified period style, a search for lost style, to borrow a Proustian phrase from Hans Edelmeyer. This longing had a history reaching back to the 18th century. Since Winckelmann, who in his History of the Art of Antiquity of 1764 had divided ancient art into 4 epochs and 4 styles, the notion of unified period style became normative. Any culture worthy of the name had a unified style. And as the rapidly expanding discipline of art history began to construct a narrative of the art of the past, it became conspicuously apparent that, as the art historian Richard Mutter conceded in 1893, the 19th century has no style. He added, "This statement has been uttered so often it has become a cliché." When this fact about the present was contrasted with the cultures of the past, it became for many a deeply troubling symptom. In his untimely meditations, the young Friedrich Nietzsche declared a unified style to be the sine qua non of culture. I quote, "Culture is above all a unity of artistic style in all manifestations of the life of a people. Contemporary Germany," he continued, "embodied the antithesis of culture. Barbarism, stylelessness, or the chaotic confusion of all styles." Those are Nietzsche's words. I'm getting a bit of sort of hearing an echo of my own voice. Can it be turned down just a bit so people can still hear me? Okay, all right, that's better. Thank you. This trenchant critique of eclecticism was widespread in the late 19th century. The artist Max Klinger's Complaint is a typical example. Daily we read in every art publication laments on the stylelessness of our era. In architecture, sculpture, and painting, we are dependent on other, earlier, dead movements. We now have the art of building and the art of sculpture, the art of painting and reproductive arts, and also decorative and applied arts. But we lack the great synthetic expression of our view of life. We have arts, but no art. And in this confusion, we cry out for style. The notion that a distinctive style was a defining condition of culture persisted into the early 20th century, reinforced by the writings of Alois Riegel and Heinrich Wölfflin. And it was embraced by many of the young critics who promoted the new art they called expressionism. Wilhelm Hausenstein was among them. The idea of style, rigorously conceived, he wrote in 1913, means the firmly unified synthesis of all forms of existence. An art that is truly deserving of the name of style was achieved wherever art was a function of a well-organized society. The decisive factor is whether the artist serves a community or whether he is only a provider of individual delectation, the master of pleasure for sublime private enthusiasms for the individual, whether he subordinates himself to collective concepts of beauty or sacrifices himself to the art enthusiast who has isolated himself from the life of the community. Style is the most hostile form of opposition to the principle of individualism. Like many critics of his generation who had forged the concept of expressionism, Hausenstein had believed that with the new the notion that a distinctive style, like many critics of his generation who had forged the concept of expressionism, Hausenstein had believed that with the new art, modern Europe was at last on the threshold of a unified period style, a collective style. Expressionism, he confidently asserted, meant a catastrophe for naturalism and a triumph of style. But by the end of the war, for him and others who shared this hope, the dream of such a unified collective style had collapsed, leaving in its wake a deep cultural pessimism. One now had to recognize that the sheer teeming diversity of modern art, its virulent individualism, made the prospect of a collective style an absurd fantasy. Writing in 1920, Hausenstein now asked, "What is expressionism? Who is an expressionist?" One could just as well maintain that no one is an expressionist as claim that all are, or a few, because it is not certain what expressionism is. Acknowledging the immeasurable span between, these are his words, Picasso and Nolde, Kandinsky and Rousseau, Klee and Meidner, Seewald and Kokoschka, he painfully conceded the common denominator vanishes. It was in this frame of mind that Hausenstein wrote his book on Klee. Picasso's stylistic pluralism was much debated in its time and in our own, and it has been the subject of a thick book by the British scholar Elizabeth Cowling. Yet Klee's far more extreme stylistic pluralism has up to now been largely ignored in the vast literature on his art. When scholars deal with the formal aspects of his work, they usually do so either with reference to his theoretical and pedagogical writings or by discussing his relationship to contemporary developments such as Cubism and the Bauhaus. And because the topic has been largely ignored, there's been no assessment of Klee's practice in the context of the period's debates about style, nor has anyone considered its implications either for our understanding of early 20th century modernism or our broader thinking about the phenomenon of style. What I want to do here is to examine Klee's practice with regard to style and how Wilhelm Hausenstein, in my view, the critic who grasped most fully the radical implications of that practice, interpreted it. His interpretation anticipates in striking ways that of one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers, which I will take up later. In conclusion, I will turn from historiography to methodology, offering an expanded model of stylistic analysis that I believe enables us to grasp more fully the complexity of Klee's practice. We would do well to pause a moment and clarify what is generally meant by style in the visual arts. The definition offered by Meyer Shapiro in his classic essay on style from 1953 probably captures best how the term has generally functioned in art history and art criticism since the late 18th century. By style, Shapiro writes, is usually meant the constant form and sometimes the constant elements, qualities, and expression in the art of an individual or group. For the art historian, style is above all a system of forms with a quality and meaningful expression through which the personality of the artist and the broad outlook of a group are visible. Although there is no established system of analysis, in general, the description of style refers to three aspects of art: form elements or motifs, form relationships, and qualities, including an all-over quality which one may call the expression. It will become apparent that Klee's exuberantly polymorphous art exposes the inadequacies of such a working definition. Here you see a photograph of Klee's studio at the Weimar Bauhaus, taken in 1926. Only a few of the paintings on the easel can be clearly identified, yet one can nevertheless see clearly enough to establish that there are paintings in several different styles, all of which we may assume were in progress or had been recently finished. Lothar Schreier, a colleague at the Bauhaus, recalled Klee's working method. He liked to paint on several pictures at the same time. He went from one painting to the next, dabbing colors on this one, then on another. Taking Schreier's remark together with the photograph, we can reasonably conclude that in a given painting session, Klee most likely worked on pictures with, to use Shapiro's terms, different form elements, form relationships, and qualities that were anything but constant. In short, he worked in different styles. Randomly examining a cross-section of works from the year 1925, we can see that within the span of a single year, Klee produced a stylistically more heterogeneous body of work than did many of his contemporaries in an entire lifetime. Compare the taut, pristine geometric style of Mountains in Winter on the left, created by spraying watercolor onto stencils that had been laid over paper prepared with a dark brown ground, with Orchard, a colorful dapple sheet of loosely applied dabs of oil color. The first work, devoid of brushwork, was created with no direct trace of the human hand. The second is dominated by staccato touches of the brush. We encounter a third style in Old Cemetery with its muted yet warmly glowing colors in severe linear architectonic style. Instead of the free brushwork of Orchard, there are extremely delicate hatchings that border the crisp lines of the angular forms. In another work from the same year, Oriental Pleasure Garden, we see yet another combination, the deployment of linear architectural structures such as we find in Old Cemetery, but with conspicuous dabs of color closer to the painterly technique of Orchard. Fine hatchings like those in Old Cemetery figure even more prominently in crucifers and spiral blossoms. While in Old Cemetery, the extremely thin parallel lines appear curiously like a delicate fringe, an ornament adorning the architectural elements, in this work they seem to constitute the very tissue of these fanciful botanical forms. And still we are not done with Klee's styles of 1925. In that year he made around 20 fictive portraits and physiognomic compositions in several distinct styles. And Little Girl Portrait in Yellow, executed in oil with watercolor glazes on muslin, a figure rendered in closed contours appears transparent over a textured ground of subtly shifting colors. In The Mask with the Little Flag on the right, Klee used the same technique of sprayed color and stencils as in Mountains in Winter, but now with a different formal vocabulary. And alongside the figurative styles of 1925, Klee also produced a series of abstract paintings in watercolors composed of color squares, of which the oil paintings May Picture and Ancient Sound are examples. And even with what I have shown you, I have not exhausted all of the styles of 1925, but the extraordinary stylistic diversity of Klee's practice should by now be apparent. Klee had relatively little to say in his writings, diaries, letters, pedagogical and theoretical texts about style. To be sure, in his diaries there are a few passages in which he writes of a personal style. "I am my style" appears in an early entry, when Klee is 21 years old and had not yet produced his first important works. In 1906, he declared that in his art he has at least reached the point where he can, as he puts it, convert nature directly into my style. All will become Klee. And 2 years later, one finds one's style there where he cannot do otherwise. The path to style, know thyself. All of these remarks represent a conventional notion of personal style, of a unique style as individual expression. By the following year, however, Klee adopted a practice in which his style was no longer singular, less a matter of a univocal expression of personality than of choice, with a practice distinguished by a plurality of contemporaneous styles. It began with a series of drawings. As a young artist, Klee had repeatedly struggled against his literary inclinations, as he called them, namely his desire to use his art as an expression of ideas, and resolved to renounce temporarily the expression of his feelings and fantasies and commit himself to the study of nature, with Impressionism as his guide. But if Klee invoked the late 19th century model of Impressionism as his model, what he actually did on the formal plane was decidedly more radical. In their dissection of the pictorial means, these works are in principle much closer to the spirit, if not the appearance, of Cubism, indeed to the phase in the work of Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque that began only 1 year later in 1910 when they punctured the pictorial fiction of closed form and began to deploy line and color as independent elements. Klee called the principle on which he based these works of 1909-10 the Reinzug der Mittel, which I would translate roughly as the cultivation of the pictorial means in their purity. Elsewhere, he referred to the isolation of the plastic elements. In working from nature, he isolated the three basic elements of painting, line, tone, and color, from one another by deploying each of them as an autonomous and sometimes as the exclusive means of representation. In the pen drawing, Five Oaks, which you see here, and in a series of other drawings, Klee set himself the goal of representing a landscape motif purely by means of line, yet without deploying that line to create closed contours. Out of bundles of uniformly delicate, undulating strokes of his pen, Klee conjures up a windy, sun-drenched landscape. The lines enclose nothing, nor are they grouped into hatchings to form masses of light and shade. In themselves, the individual pen strokes are thoroughly non-mimetic. Trunks, foliage, grass are rendered with the same fragile, meandering lines, like broken threads. Only through their placement, their syntax, do they evoke the optical impression of an arboreal landscape, while steadfastly retaining their identity as individual marks of the pen. In a second group, Klee allowed himself to use line as closed contour, but in a thoroughly unconventional way. In a pen drawing of Bern with its soaring cathedral, the lines serve not to denote solid forms, but function, as Klee formulated it, as a substitute for omitted tonal values. Line as the contour of a tonal value or of color contrast. That is to say, it is not solid forms that are circumscribed by lines, but the areas of brightest value. Islands of light, Klee called them. The dark areas are indicated with dense zigzag strokes. The middle tones remain, in his formulation, silently between them. This results in an extremely curious and decidedly anti-naturalistic effect. The buildings assume forms that are fully unarchitectonic. Horizontals and verticals are nowhere to be found. The cathedral tower seems shattered into pieces. In another variant of the Bern Cathedral, a pen drawing with wash, Klee again enclosed the brightest areas with line while rendering the shadows with areas of tone. The principle here was to avoid what Klee called the Kombinationsteufel, the devil of combination. That is, any technique in which the individual element of line and ink wash were fused. As he later formulated it, the elements should produce forms, but without sacrificing themselves in the process. Each pictorial element had to preserve its identity, its purity. Tonal values, for example, must not be deployed as modeling in a subordinate role to line, as the creator of form. They must themselves create forms independent of those created by line. It is entirely consistent with this method of working that Klee also invented a style devoid of lines in which tonal values constitute the only formal element. During the summer of 1910, Klee also experimented with color in this vein. He called this technique die Lichtform, light form. By squinting his eyes to blur the focus of the motif with the help of a lens, he observed, all detail simply falls away. By means of what he called a coloristic extract of natural appearance, he now succeeded in treating color as an isolated, independent means of representation, just as he had done earlier with line and tonal values. In the years 1910 to 1916, it was a chief concern of Klee to find a way to combine line with color, but in such a way that each element in the construction performed a self-sufficient function in creating form, without one being subordinate to the other. Not until 1916 did Klee reach that goal. A 1918 watercolor classification is an example of a mode of working in which line and color function as autonomous elements, each remarkably in its own style. The color is applied in amorphous tints or abstract thick bands to form zigzag motifs. Line, on the other hand, fine and delicate, forms a transparent representational structure. Neither does the line serve as a contour for the color planes, nor does color serve merely to fill in the linear configurations. Each forms a construction in itself. Together they form a complex contrapuntal structure, more reminiscent of music than of anything in traditional painting. In the lecture Klee gave in the Jena Art League in January 1924, a decade and a half after these experiments, he referred to line, tone, and color as the bildnerische Elementarmittel, plastic elementary means. They constituted the foundation of all plastic art, the building materials of pictorial form. Reflecting on his own artistic activity, Klee pointed out the variability of his formal modes. I have tried pure drawing. I have tried painting in pure tones and values. And in color, I have tried all the various operations that have been stimulated by my orientation toward the color wheel. Then I tried all possible syntheses of two methods, combining and recombining, but of course, always preserving and cultivating the elements in their purity. With reference to the approach to his medium that Klee describes in this passage, the concept of style as it was understood by the art history and art criticism of the period is fully inadequate and irrelevant. And not only in that period. Hans Sedlmayr, who clung to that concept of style and to the norm of unified period style, understood as much when in 1948 in Verlust der Mitte, translated into English as Art in Crisis, The Lost Center, his notorious reactionary attack on the art of the 19th and 20th centuries, he cited this very passage by Klee with the following gloomy commentary. Around 1925, a point is reached beyond which a further dissection of the arts into elements seems unimaginable. And with that, the unity of the arts is finally over and done with. Sedlmayr. Klee's most developed remarks on style are found in his pedagogical manuscripts from his years at the Bauhaus. In the 24 sections of the Bildnerische Gestaltungslehre, or theory of pictorial form, which constitute the major part of his pedagogical writings, Klee takes up the theory of style. He does so in detail in the 21st section under the rubric Statics. The title of the first lecture in the series, and here I show the first page of Klee's manuscript, dating from 1924, is Pictorial Mechanics, and beneath it, in the section that's outlined there at the top in red, beneath the term pictorial mechanics, bildnerische Mechanik, is the word Stillehre, or theory of style. Pictorial mechanics, what Klee calls pictorial mechanics, deals with principles of construction with reference to the static and dynamic. Klee begins by offering a dictionary definition. Mechanics is the science that deals with the laws of movement and equilibrium, broken down into dynamics and statics. Then he immediately proceeds to question this definition. I quote, "For equilibrium is not only a matter of the static realm, but there is also an equilibrium of movement, especially in the pictorial domain." Late in the manuscript, Klee declares that at bottom, style concerns our disposition to these questions of the this-worldly, diesseitiges, and the otherworldly, jenseitiges. This is not so mystical as it may sound. Klee identifies the first term, this-worldly, with the gravity of the earth, the second with the freedom of cosmic space. And he goes on to link this binary opposition with two opposed styles. Accordingly, he continues, in the domain of style, there are two major categories. In the first, the concept of the static is analogous to the classical. In the second, the dynamic and romanticism are related. Yet these are not absolutes. There are two poles, and between them there is a range of possibilities combining elements of both. The Baroque Klee describes as a domain of style in which, I quote, "the dynamic lightly swirls about the static, symmetrical and carefully balanced." He then proposes that all historical styles can be thought of in terms of particular combinations of these two polarities. I quote, "In this way, one could investigate countless examples of all kinds of styles. The question, Romanesque, Gothic, late Gothic, the classical as Renaissance or as Empire, Baroque or Rococo, gains a precise aspect through a critique that takes their nature into account with respect to their mechanics. This nature is defined by mechanics with its corresponding principles of the earthly and the cosmic, lends itself more readily to intellectual comprehension than the preoccupation with the external formal identifying features of all of the various styles." That's paraphrasing Klee there. In effect, Klee here seems to be extrapolating underlying formal principles from historical styles, and in so doing to be dehistoricizing those principles, as is suggested in the continuation of this passage. Even today, we no longer regard these specific styles either as transient or alive. Of what relevance to our creative work is the Gothic or the Rococo? Instead, the artist thinks in terms of movement that may be either free or contingent, emphasizing now one aspect, now the other, in continual periodic alternation, or combining both. All of these become possibilities for the contemporary artist, and in practice they were as well for Klee. Such a fundamental conception of visual form, which is nascent already in his drawings and watercolors of 1909 to 1911, perhaps helps explain the staggering unequal diversity of his artistic production. Klee's name represents no system. This remark appears in the doleful passage from Hausenstein's Kairouan that I cited at the beginning of this paper. We recall that system is a term that Shapiro would later use in his definition of style. I repeat the quotation: style is above all a system of forms. But system had been used before in the most influential text on style from the time in which Hausenstein was writing. Heinrich Wölfflin's Principles of Art History, The Problem of the Development of Style in Later Art, published in 1915. It was already in its 5th edition by 1921 when Hausenstein's book appeared. Whatever the individual or collective temperament, Wölfflin wrote, every artist finds certain optical possibilities before him, by which he meant what he called the prevailing Formensystem, system of forms, either classical or Baroque, and continuing Wölfflin's passage, to which the artist is bound. Not everything is possible at all times. These basic form systems, as everyone knows, were the linear, which Wölfflin identified with the art and architecture of the 16th century, and the painterly, manifested by the art and architecture of the 17th. They were the basic universal form systems, recurring cyclically in a spiral movement throughout history. Hausenstein had reviewed Wölfflin's Principles of Art History in 1916. He was, it's clear in reading the review, particularly struck by the way in which Wölfflin had reduced the diverse art and architecture of the 16th and 17th century to contrasting systems. And I quote, Wölfflin systematically develops the contrast between the Baroque and the classical. The system is structured in 5 categories. The classic and the Baroque differ in the contrast of the linear and the painterly, of planarity and depth, of closed and open form, of multiplicity and unity, of clarity and deliberate methodical unclarity. At no point does the system become obscured by the philologically exacting detail of Wölfflin's analysis, and at the same time the system maintains a subtle liberality that loves the general for the sake of the particular. Hausenstein ends his review by speculating whether Wölfflin favors the Baroque. This book, in spite of its reserved neutrality, is affectingly modern, he writes. It has revealed the poles of art history. The world is leaping from the classical to the Baroque, from yesterday to today. In light of this review, Hausenstein's remark that Klee's art represents no system assumes an added resonance, for system presupposed an internal consistency of style. Klee, with his virulent pluralism of styles, his simultaneous practice of linear and painterly, including even the combination of both in a single work, decisively shattered Hausenstein's expectations of the future course of art. For Klee, one might say with only slight exaggeration, it seems that pace Wölfflin, everything is possible at all times. His art was a devastating refutation of Hausenstein's anticipation of a triumph of style, of which he had been so confident only a few years before. Yet another author was, I want to propose, even more important for Hausenstein's Klee interpretation than Wölfflin, Oswald Spengler. The first volume of The Decline of the West appeared in the summer of 1918 as the catastrophic war was in its final stages. The book came as a particularly brutal shock to the German art world, dealing a lethal blow to what was left of its utopian expectations for expressionism, which Spangler dismissed as a farce organized by the art dealers. The topic, the problem of style, appears in the book's table of contents. The problem of style, to which Spangler referred, was not a problem of art historical method. It was a problem of civilization. Style was a defining feature of great vital cultures, and it was now, he asserted, a thing of the past. Style is, and I quote Spangler, style is destiny, Schicksal. One has it, one does not acquire it. Conscious, willfully, deliberately fabricated style is bogus style, as is proved by all late phases of an era, by the present era above all, end quote. Style in this sense, style is destiny, Spangler declared, had ended in the late 18th century. As for the present, he wrote, forcibly staged styles and exotic derivations are supposed to make up for the lack of destiny, of inner necessity. Half-seriousness and dubious authenticity are the dominant characteristics of today's artist. This is where we find ourselves today. It is an extended play with dead forms with which one would like to sustain the illusion of a living art. The first sentence of the first draft of Hausenstein's Kairouan, his book on clay, confirms Spangler's impact on his thinking. It reads, "Decline of the West as starting point." Hausenstein's writings from this period leave no doubt that he had accepted Spangler's bleak verdict on the status of style and modernity. Yet rather than seeing Klay's art as one of those forcibly staged styles and exotic derivations, as Spangler surely would have, in his text Hausenstein repeatedly uses the term Schicksal, destiny, as he narrates Klay's artistic development. If for Spangler true style is destiny, Hausenstein seems to be saying Klay's systemless art of multiple styles is equally a matter of destiny, of historical fate, not a matter of individual caprice or willfulness. To be sure, Hausenstein does twice refer to Klay's style in the singular, but it is clear that this style no longer has anything in common with Hausenstein's earlier understanding of the concept, and so he rewrites the terms. Klay's style is individual, thoroughly personal, durchaus persönlich, Hausenstein calls it, something that he had earlier denied as a possibility, as a contradiction of the very principle of style. Recall his words, style is the most hostile form of opposition to the principle of individualism. Spangler himself was adamant on this point. I quote, styles have nothing to do with the personality of individual artists, with their will and consciousness. On the contrary, style, by which he meant style as unconscious collective phenomenon, constitutes the a priori basis for artistic individuality, close quote. But now for Hausenstein, Klay's extremely individualistic art, so antithetical to his deeply held convictions about the social basis of style, is not a manifestation of will, but of destiny. In a particularly searing passage, he writes of Klay's works of the years 1917 to 19, during the war and its immediate aftermath. It was a matter of destiny. What could one paint in all that was history, event, person, or thing, or disposition? There was nothing under these circumstances that counted for anything. The world was nothing. Everything human had withdrawn from it. Things were used up. Hollow spaces remained coated with dust. Windows shattered and were patched over with strips of paper resembling crazy drawings. And now for Hausenstein, since the world of nature that had sustained art for millennia had been devastated by war and technology, subjectivity became the sole possibility. I quote, "The subjective is truly not the highest thing, but at this moment it is the only thing. And the artist who is able to find therein the beauty of rhyme is a miracle of heaven. Where the objective is lost, there is also lost any natural community. Where that disappears, the subject becomes content and law." As recently as 1918, Hausenstein had found the subjectivity of Klay's art deeply unsettling. This is 3 years before Kairouan, even ominous for the future of art. It was, in his words, a subjectivity so hard to fathom that it threatens to spell the end of the inalienable concept of a public for art. Possibly the path of art will lead there. That cannot be foreseen. Moreover, it is not to be wished. This statement, so startling in its directness, should surprise only for its candor. It is a position thoroughly consistent with the conclusions of Hausenstein's sober reevaluation of expressionism. To be clear, the issue was not Klee's purely artistic merits. Hausenstein now believed him to be without peer, placing him even above Picasso. But his art, at the extreme limits of abstraction and subjectivity, stood as the antithesis of the values that Hausenstein felt must now, of historical necessity, be recuperated. A more humble, more objective devotion to nature, an awareness of the metaphysical dimension in the world of perceived reality, a restoration of a collective basis for culture. And yet it was significantly, precisely at this time, that Hausenstein resolved to write his book on Klee. It was, let us recall the full title, not only a story of the painter Klee, but also of the art of this time. And so what was to be the content of such a subjective art? An art representing a world from which, as Hausenstein saw it, objects had vanished. Art's task, Hausenstein declared, was to represent the nothingness of the epoch. Here I show you the cited passage, Das Nichts der Epoche, beneath a wartime drawing by Klee called The Fallen, Gefallene. Certainly, and here are illustrations from Hausenstein's book again, certainly there were still figures and objects in Klee's paintings and drawings, albeit highly abstract ones, scattered shreds of representation, Hausenstein called them, with no possibility of consolidation. Yet the real object of Klee's art, Hausenstein writes, lies in the medium itself. And I'm quoting here a longish passage. This is painted like painting, drawn like drawing. No, it is not a question of particular pictures and painters, but of painting as a type of representation. With a deft, intelligent hand, remove through the back of the picture everything, I mean everything, that is called an object. Then look at what is left. This is what they call form. An objection is imminent. One anticipates it. Form has to realize, to represent something. Of course it does. Here it represents itself. In a world from which objects have been lost, it has become its own object. Form paints itself. Drawing draws itself. The medium emancipates itself as the surf once did. Yesterday's form has become the object of form today. Although framed by Hausenstein's cultural pessimism, I think this passage reveals a genuine insight into Klee's art and anticipates remarks cited earlier that he himself would make a few years later at the Bauhaus on the subject of style. In his claim that Klee was painting itself, drawing itself, Hausenstein anticipated a little-known remark by Michel Foucault on Klee's art made in a 1966 interview. In the introduction to Les Mots et les Choses, the Order of Things is the English translation, Foucault described Velázquez's Las Meninas as a painting in which, quote, Foucault, representation undertakes to represent itself, here in all its elements, with its images, the eyes to which it is offered, the faces it makes visible, the gestures that call it into being, end quote. What does Foucault mean? Velázquez shows himself in the act of painting. We see the tools of pictorial representation, his brush, his palette with its pigments, the back of his canvas, which emphasizes its material instrumentality. The studio is flooded with light, that which makes visible, that which enables seeing. We see perspective, which gives the scene the illusion of being an extension of the space that we, the spectators, inhabit. And we see a mirror showing King Philip IV and Queen Mariana, which extends the space of the representation into our space. Finally, above in the shadows, we see a series of paintings on the wall, end products of the practice of representation exemplified below. In the aforementioned 1966 interview, which appeared 2 months after the publication of Les Mots et les Choses, the interviewer Claude Bonnefoy raised the issue of contemporary philosophy, raised with Foucault the issue of contemporary philosophy and how it differed from that of the past. Today, the object of our thought, Foucault responded, is no longer nature or man and society or human existence as such, but knowledge itself, the relations between the different domains of knowledge. At the end of the interview, Bonnefoy asked Foucault, what work of art gives visual form to this, the episteme of our epoch, as Velázquez's Las Meninas gave visual form to the episteme of his time? This was his response. It seems to me that Klee's painting best represents, in terms of our century, what Velázquez was able to do in relation to his. To the extent that Klee renders visible all of the gestures, acts, graphisms, traces, lineaments, surfaces, which are able to constitute painting, he makes the very act of painting the manifest and brilliant knowledge of painting itself. His painting is painting grasped anew by the knowledge of its most fundamental elements. And these elements, apparently the most simple and spontaneous, the very ones that do not appear and that it seems never ought to appear, it is these that Klee distributes over the surface of the painting. Las Meninas represents all the elements of representation: the painter, the models, the brush, the canvas, the image, and the mirror. They decompose painting itself into the elements that would make a representation. Klee's painting composes and decomposes painting into the elements which, on account of their being simple, are no less supported, haunted, and inhabited by the knowledge of painting. It is an interpretation that in some of its particulars was anticipated 45 years earlier by Hausenstein. Both Hausenstein and Foucault are in agreement. Klee is a unique figure within modernism, one who in his art reveals its distinguishing theoretical foundations. Yet Foucault takes it further than Hausenstein to argue that Klee's art is itself a form of knowledge. To repeat his formulation, he makes the very act of painting the manifest and brilliant knowledge of painting itself. It is a claim corroborated by the extraordinary ambition of Klee's pedagogical manuscripts, which were only partially available at the time. So, moving into the last part of this lecture, so where does this leave us with respect to the problem of style? What I've done thus far is to investigate an episode in Klee's reception with the aim of situating his practice in relation to the contemporary German discourse on style. But I think that Klee's example should be seen as more than a fascinating footnote in the historiography of style or of Klee reception. His art offers a powerful challenge to our received notions about style and an invitation to rethink the concept. There is, I believe, a concept of style that comes closer than any other to accommodating the complexity of Klee's practice, precisely by severing the concept of style from unilinear historical narratives and the assumption of common denominators that so long marked the role of style in art historical discourse. I'm referring to a short, brilliant, and unjustly overlooked paper by George Kubler, published in 1979, Toward a Reductive Theory of Visual Style. Kubler begins by lamenting the confusion surrounding the concept of style. Style, he writes, had become a word of which the everyday use has deteriorated in our time to the level of banality. It is now a word to avoid, along with déclassé words, words without nuance, words gray with fatigue. His intention as he formulated it was to discover the purposes to which the word in question was appropriate and to demonstrate its present unacceptable uses. In so doing, Kubler offered not only a fundamental reconceptualization of style, but a radically new analytical model. Kubler was pointedly critical of the definition of style offered by Meyer Shapiro, who he claimed, and I quote Kubler, insists upon style as constant form in the art of individuals and societies. These notions had led to the belief that a style was something that existed in duration. Such thinking, Kubler complained, endows styles with attributes like those of allegorical figures in stone or bronze in a palace park. Moreover, art historians often think of style as akin to language, as a system of rules, signs, and practices that had an existence outside of individual works of art. Yet style, Kubler objected, was not a phenomenon like a language, which is a genuine system capable of development over time. Style, rather, is a concept, one external to the objects to which it is applied. There may be a class of objects produced over time and linked by a common style, but the style itself is not something that evolves over time, manifesting itself in individual works in the way that individual speech acts are manifestations of a language. For Kubler, then, style is less a concept to be applied to temporal, developmental, or diachronic phenomena than it is a spatial or synchronic taxonomic one applied to objects coexisting in time. In other words, it is a term of classification rather than of development. Although Kubler called his theory reductive, it is reductive only in its emphasis on the synchronic rather than the diachronic dimensions of style. For in actuality, Kubler's concept of style is more expansive than our traditional notion, which has usually been limited to questions of form, composition, and manner of execution, in the way that Shapiro defines it. His concept of style and his method of stylistic analysis, which he calls componential, applies to, in his words, all essential characteristics of works of art. And this is a diagram from the essay. By componential, Kubler means that visual style is a manifold, a complex of distinct particulars of 6 independently variable dimensions. These he groups under 3 aspects: shape, meaning, and time, each of which has 2 components. First, there is shape, which encompasses craft and format. Craft refers to materials and techniques, elements omitted from Shapiro's definition of style. What Kubler terms format, on the other hand, which identifies, this is his definition, identifies stable configurations enduring through time as recognizable entities, encompasses those features that are traditionally identified with style, what Shapiro called form elements and form relationships. Indeed, this alone of Kubler's 6 components of style belongs to the traditional concept. He remarks on a common confusion between style and format. With the second pair of components, which he groups under meaning, Kubler incorporates 2 dimensions of works of art normally excluded from what is understood as style. These he identifies as signage and modus. Signage is, simply put, the subject matter of the work of art. I quote, "Any complex of structured symbols which can be subjected to iconographic or iconological analysis," end quote. If signage refers to content embodied in subject matter and symbolism, modus relates to the manner in which the artist chooses to express that content. The third pair of components relates to time and consists of period and sequence. Kubler says frustratingly little about period. Sequence, an important concept in his earlier book, The Shape of Time, refers to the dated succession of gradually altered repetitions of the same trait. By introducing sequence into his model, Kubler presumably wants us to recognize that each of the traits chosen in the 4 preceding components, technique, format, signage, craft, format, signage, and modus, is subject to choices as to its replication in a new work, and that each trait also has its own age, its own history within the medium and in the art of an individual or group. As he had written earlier in The Shape of Time, thus everything is a complex, having not only traits, each with a different systematic age, but having also clusters of traits or aspects, each with its own age. For this reason, Kubler again, historic time seems to be composed of many envelopes, in addition to being mere flow from future to past through the present. Crucial for the constitution of a style is the factor of, Kubler's phrase again, instantaneous acts of choices in each of these 6 dimensions. The particular configuration of those choices with regard to craft, format, signage, modus, sequence, and period constitutes the style. Works that share a similar manifold of traits will be classified together as sharing a style. It is in part because the style of a work of art is constructed of components of which each has a different systematic age, a different duration, that one cannot speak of a style as a unitary thing that evolves. Kubler's componential model of style with its sixfold domain of choices seems to me to offer a method that is particularly well suited to Klee's art, given the remarkable degree of variability that exists in his deployment and combination of various traits in the domains of craft, format, signage, and modus, each trait occupying a position in its respective sequence. No other artist of his generation constructed his works from such a broad range of choices in these areas. The year 1930, during which Klee made nearly 300 works in various media, is particularly rich in stylistic diversity. And a brief look at 6 of them will, I hope, demonstrate the usefulness of Kubler's theory as an analytical model. Prophet on the left and Portrait of a Scholar on the right are about as stylistically unlike one another as it is possible to imagine. In both of these works, the dimension of craft feeds into modus, the term Kubler uses for the manner in which a particular content is expressed, the how as opposed to the what. Prophet is crudely painted with colored paste. It has a raw, spontaneous look, almost as if it were an artifact from some primitive culture. The very crudity of the execution suggests an image created in a state of mystical ardor, remote from the precincts of reason. By contrast, the geometric format and methodological technique or craft, a methodical technique or craft of Portrait of a Scholar are consonant with the idea of rational investigation, of a highly developed culture of inquiry and argument. Here, Klee applied watercolor over stencils to create a crystalline planar structure, then used pen and ink to form a second linear structure, one that interacts with but remains independent of that created by color planes. Prophet and Portrait of a Scholar each share their respective traits with other works of the same year, but in varying combinations. In crystallization, for example, Klee employed the same craft and format, stencils, watercolor, and pen and ink, now with the addition of charcoal, as in Portrait of a Scholar, but chose to leave the work non-representational, making a different choice with respect to signage. Or rather, the very crystalline forms themselves could be said to be the signage of the work, embodying a process within nature. In kettle drum organ, Klee replicated the format of transparent crystalline planes, but now eliminated the use of line except for the 2 drumsticks in the upper center. And here, with respect to craft, the technique is a combination of watercolor and oil. Klee's choice to repeat or alter traits is, as we have seen, itself, for Kubler, a constitutive element of style, what Kubler calls sequence. Physiognomy of cross-sections shares with Portrait of a Scholar and crystallization the media of watercolor and ink, but here they are deployed in a different technique, while the work's format, signage, and modus are of another order altogether. In Ad Marginem, Klee introduces another variation in the domain of craft, applying watercolor over a lacquer ground on cardboard nailed to a wooden stretcher covered on its visible edges with gauze. In format, signage, and modus, each of these 2 works is as different from the other as from the 4 works discussed above, and with respect to each of these traits, they form part of different sequences. Perhaps one can say, pace Wilhelm Hausenstein, that Klee's art does have a system after all. What defines that system is a commitment to the continual exploration of the materials, formal elements, and signifying possibilities of painting and drawing. This produces an art defined by maximum variability within those domains that Kubler defined with his concepts of craft, format, signage, and modus. This is, as Foucault so well understood, an art that has been grasped anew by the knowledge of its most fundamental elements. The merit of Kubler's expanded notion of style with its componential model of analysis is that it can sharpen our perceptions of the character of these works. Rather than producing specious unities and unilinear narratives, it disposes us to look for diversity and complexity and variability in artistic practices. And this, I believe, is precisely what it does so effectively with Klee. It may be, as The art historian Frederick Schwartz has argued that the history of art is no longer the history of styles, that the notion of style is, in his words, not adequate to our thinking about visual form and representation today. Yet I would argue that conversely, any such thinking that ignores style is equally inadequate. Thank you.